Resuming debate, the honourable member St. Albert, Edmonton.
Madam Speaker, I rise to speak on the massive scandal at Sustainable Development Technology Canada, more appropriately known as the billion-dollar Liberal Green Slush Fund. This is a scandal involving $400 million taxpayer dollars that improperly went out the door, according to the Auditor General. $330 million of that involved conflicts of interest involving board members, 186 conflicts of interest, and multiple violations of the law, violations of the SDTC Act. And in the face of such a scandal, Canadians can rightly ask how it is that board members who were Liberal insiders engaged in conflicts of interest and funneled tens of millions of dollars into companies that they had interests in and got away with it for so long. Well, very simply, Madam Speaker, how this happened and why they got away with it for so long is because after 9 years of this Prime Minister, we have a government in which there is a culture of rot and corruption, a culture of rot and corruption that goes right to the top, right to the Prime Minister. This is a Prime Minister who fired his Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould when she defied his unethical and unlawful orders to interfere in the prosecution of SNC Lavalin. This is a Prime Minister who is hid behind cabinet confidence to obstruct an RCMP criminal investigation into his potential wrongdoing. This is a Prime Minister who has the distinction of being the first Prime Minister in Canadian history to be found guilty of violating the Conflict of Interest Act, not once, but twice. And given that, it reflects what we have seen at SDTC, and it also perhaps explains why it is that, as we speak, there are sitting members of the Cabinet who, like the Prime Minister, have been found guilty of violating the Conflict of Interest Act, including the Minister of International Trade and the Minister of Public Safety. And I would also mention the Liberal member for Hull Elmer, who was found guilty of breaking the Conflict of Interest Act while he served as Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. And then there is the Liberal member for Edmonton Centre, who 2 weeks ago resigned from Cabinet in disgrace. This is someone who got caught violating the Conflict of Interest Act when he was involved in the operations of a shady PPE company in direct violation of the Act while he sat in Cabinet. More than that, the member for Edmonton Centre's company has been ordered by Alberta courts to pay back clients nearly $8 million for ripping them off. It faces 7 lawsuits alleging fraud, and the Edmonton police have opened a criminal investigation into the member's company. So, Madam Speaker, all of this is to say is that there is a culture of rot, corruption, and conflict from top to bottom in this government, and it has been happening from practically day one when this Prime Minister took office. And consistent with that rotten culture, it comes as no surprise that former Liberal Minister Navdeep Bains, when he was the Industry Minister, appointed a conflicted chair to the chair as that of SDTC. Annette Beersharon was someone who no doubt had a fair amount of business experience, but she had, as I alluded to, a major problem. She had a conflict of interest insofar as her company was receiving $2.2 million from SDTC. That is a blatant conflict of interest, and it ought to have immediately disqualified her from that role. But Navdeep Bains, being in the cabinet of a corrupt and conflicted government, said conflicts be damned, and he appointed Annette Verscheren as chair. And it was from that time onward, that we saw the self-dealing, the conflicts, and the mismanagement that were identified in the Auditor General's report. Almost all of it occurred under the time that Annette Verscheren served as chair, someone who was hand-picked by Navdeep Bains. Now, at or around the time that Verscheren was appointed by Bains to serve as chair, the SDTC board adopted a conflict of interest policy that encouraged corruption. This is a policy, just to give this House, through you, Madam Speaker, an illustration of what was contained in this policy. The conflict of interest policy permitted directors to buy and sell securities within companies funded by SDTC within 3 days of a public announcement. And so, to illustrate this policy in action, a board member could sit in and vote to fund a company on Monday, and it be the project funding being announced Monday. The same director could go and buy and sell securities in that company on Thursday. It's akin to insider trading. And at the Public Accounts Committee, the Liberal member for Beaches East York took great exception when I characterized it as that. But I would remind the member, through you, Madam Chair, that it is completely at odds with the rules of the Ontario Securities Commission for publicly traded companies, rules relating specifically to insider trading and self-dealing. No wonder, because, as I said, Madam Speaker, it's akin to insider trading. Pursuant to the rules of the Ontario Securities Commission, publicly traded companies, directors of those companies, can only buy and sell shares on a limited basis outside of the quarterly financial reporting periods. But here you had a policy that basically allowed members to get rich with insider information. Total corruption. If the member for Beaches East York wants to dispute that it's insider trading, it certainly is corruption. And, Madam Speaker, not only did the policy give a green light to essentially insider trading, it also violated the standards provided for in the Conflict of Interest Act. Now, why is that a problem? Well, among the problems with that is that 7 of the 14 board members were appointed by Cabinet. They were GIC appointments and therefore bound by the Conflict of Interest Act, and yet you had a policy at SDTC that violated the Conflict of Interest Act and also violated the SDTC Act, specifically Section 12.2, no director shall profit or gain any income or acquire any property from the foundation or its activities. And yet, Madam Speaker, that is precisely what happened again and again and again at SDTC. The Auditor General found that 5 out of 15 board members, so a third of the board, had interests in companies that were being funded by SDTC while they sat on the board, in blatant conflicts of interest and in blatant violation of the SDTC Act. One such example involves the chair herself, Ms. Verscheren. She voted to funnel, and not only voted, but actually moved 2 motions to funnel $38.5 million into SDTC companies under the guise of being so-called COVID relief payments, payments that the Auditor General determined to be improper and outside of the scope of the contribution agreements with the Department of Industry. So $38.5 million of mismanagement, pretty bad. But even worse, arguably, is that $220,000 of that went into her own company and her store. And as I noted, Ms. Verscheren is a woman with vast business experience and vast experience sitting on corporate boards. It shouldn't take someone with that experience. It frankly is a matter of common sense to know that it is completely unethical and a conflict of interest to sit on a board and move a motion to funnel money into one's company. Not only is it a conflict of interest, I would say there's another word for it. It's called stealing. Stealing taxpayers' money, and Ms. Verscheren was found guilty by the Ethics Commissioner for that blatant conflict. And, Madam Speaker, then there's Andre-Lise Matteau. She is a close associate of the radical Environment Minister. Ms. Matteau came to the Public Accounts Committee and admitted that SDTC funneled $10.4 million into companies that she had interest in. Now, she said, I identified that I had a conflict and that I left the room. But of course, Madam Speaker, that isn't good enough. I mean, think about it. It's not good enough in the context of a board member saying, I have a conflict, therefore I'm going to leave the room, and the board votes to funnel $10.4 million into my companies, and then I come back and another board member leaves the room and the board votes to funnel money into that member's companies. And that occurred again and again, 186 times. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. I mean, it speaks to a culture of total corruption. So yes, she can argue I technically recused myself, but come on. And Madam Speaker, it's further not good enough because it violates the SDTC Act. Not profiting, not gaining, not acquiring property. That is strictly prohibited, but there was Matteau cashing in $10.4 million in unlawful payments approved by the board. And when I put it to her at committee that she had blatantly violated the SDTC Act, she had no answer. It was almost as if she was taken aback, speaking to the degree to which there was a culture of conflict and entitlement that permeated the SDTC board for so many years under former Liberal Minister Baines's watch and the current minister's watch. And the ministers say, well, they didn't really know anything about it, that SDTC is an arm's-length foundation. Well, Madam Speaker, that is hardly an excuse. We're talking about $1 billion taxpayer dollars, $1 billion taxpayer dollars, and you have a former minister, Madam Speaker, and a current minister who basically try to wash their hands clean and say, forget about the $400 million, forget about the $330 million involving conflicts of board members, forget 186 conflicts of interest. It wasn't my responsibility. Madam Speaker, the Auditor General's report is an indictment of the lack of oversight provided under the two ministers, Baines and the current minister. And it's an absolute indictment, the report, but it's worse than that because there was someone who, according to Deputy Minister, was the department's eyes and ears at every one of these Green Slush Fund board meetings. The Assistant Deputy Minister, Andrew Noseworthy, he sat there as there were 186 conflicts of interest, as tens of millions of dollars were funneled into the companies of board members. And he appeared before the Public Accounts Committee last Thursday. And he claimed, or his excuse was that he had no independent way of verifying conflicts of interest. No independent way. Sitting there, 186 conflicts of interest, but he had no way to determine that there were conflicts of interest. And I said to him, well, sir, that is impossible. That can't be true, because there was plenty of evidence before committee that the practice at SDTC was for an agenda to be sent out weeks before the meeting, in which board members were then invited to identify those projects in which they had conflicts of interest or proposed projects. At the beginning of each meeting, that the secretary would then read out those members who had identified conflicts of interest while Noseworthy was sitting there. So I said, that simply can't be true. So Noseworthy said, after he got caught misleading committee, to come up with the response that it wasn't his fiduciary duty to report on these conflicts and corruption. It wasn't his fiduciary duty. It speaks not only to a culture of rot, conflict, and corruption that goes right to the top of SDTC's leadership with Ms. Verscheren, right to the top with members of this cabinet and the Prime Minister, but it also speaks to a complete level of contempt for taxpayers' money by this government. And, Madam Speaker, I have to say I'm just flabbergasted by that testimony, but perhaps I shouldn't be flabbergasted because, again, it goes back to this culture of corruption that is so embedded in this government. And so here we are, nearly more than 2 months after this House ordered the government to turn over all documents relating to SDTC so that they in turn can be turned over by the law clerk to the RCMP. And more than 2 months later, we still don't have the documents. And it begs the question, why? And the only plausible explanation is that what is contained in those documents is really, really bad. We know, based upon the Auditor General's report, that there was a total lack of oversight at SDTC. We know that in some instances the government, ministers of this government, encouraged or tolerated conflicts of interest, such as Baines hand-picking Verscheren to serve as chair, notwithstanding that she had a conflict of interest. And we know that these ministers had to have known that all was not well at SDTC, given the fact that they had an eyes and ears sitting in on each of these meetings. And so, and we also know, Madam Speaker, from the whistleblower, that despite the minister's assertion that he took action when he learned of wrongdoing, that isn't so, that the minister was more interested in protecting himself and protecting the insiders who got rich, and was prepared to take steps to cover up for as long as possible this massive scandal. Well, Madam Speaker, the government's refusal to turn over the documents, to black out thousands and thousands of pages of documents, is a continuation of the cover-up. And, Madam Speaker, the bottom line is that heads need to roll. There needs to be accountability. We need to get fully to the bottom of this massive scandal. If there's criminal wrongdoing, then the RCMP needs that evidence, and taxpayers need to be made whole from these Liberal insiders. And until so long as this government continues to block and obstruct this House order, we're going to continue to stand up for taxpayers and demand the release of the documents.